Have you ever wondered how your office space is actually being used? If you knew, could you optimize or even reduce your real estate? Get to know OccuSpace, the only infinitely scalable, instantly deployable, privacy-first occupancy measuring solution that shows you what's going on so you can stop guessing and start knowing. This simple plug-and-play format requires zero infrastructure changes. Easily capture reliable data to optimize space allocation and design, improve employee experience, and reduce costly unused spaces. OccuSpace can measure utilization for a single office floor or across your entire real estate portfolio. Your data is always accessible. With a glance at your dashboard through digital signage or seamlessly integrated to any third-party platform via API. OccuSpace, the simplest, most cost-effective way to stop guessing and start knowing.
Sandra, I think you're on mute.
Yeah.
You're still muted.
Poor Sandra. Joys of technology these days.
Yeah.
There we go.
There she is.
Let's switch it out here.
You're all good.
You're good.
No, she's frozen.
Uh-oh.
Can you hear me? Am I back?
Yeah.
Yes.
You're
Okay,
back.
we're good. I'm having some internet issues today, so my apologies. I'm hopping between Bell and Rogers, Brian.
Stick with Roger.
Welcome everyone to today's LinkedIn Live session, focused on the critical role that data is shaping on return to office policies. Thanks for joining us for the next hour. It's great to have you all here. Before we dive deeper, I have a question to the audience. Please put your responses in the comments. The question is, what key data points should guide RTO policies and why? Said we're interested in hearing your thoughts and comments. So today's session is being recorded and will be shared directly to your inbox if you provided your email. We'll also be sharing links to the panelists' LinkedIn pages and any supporting articles that we talk about in this session. We also encourage you to ask questions during the discussion, and we'll try to answer as many as we can during the session, and we'll follow up afterwards if we don't get to all of them. That being said, I'd like to now introduce you all to our distinguished panelists. First, we have Brian Elliott, co-founder of Future Forum, published author and advisor to various innovative projects and companies. He's also an ex-slacker. Brian's experience helps leaders build flexible work environments that are good for both people and organizations. We also have Brian Aman, who is the Senior Corporate Real Estate Business Partner at Rogers Communications here in Toronto. He brings a wealth of experience in optimizing corporate real estate to enhance organizational functionality and employee satisfaction. Then we have Kara Dennison. She is an executive career and leadership coach, a Forbes contributor, and an organizational strategy consultant. Kara works with many Fortune 100 companies to drive engagement and productivity. Albert de Plazaola is the global principal of strategy at Unispace, an expert in translating data into meaningful workspace design strategies, and was also, I learned this morning, previously employed by probably one of my favorite companies from the 2000s, DEGW. And finally, Nick Halverson, our own CEO and CEO of OccuSpace, who is leading the charge in space utilization technology to optimize physical workspace with usage, with the underlying goal of reducing wasted resources. So welcome to everyone on the panel today. So let's get started. So CBRE reported not too long ago that while 80% of companies have return to office policies, only 17% are actually enforcing it. We can all agree that metrics are triggers for change. And what better year for trigger for change than 2020, which was a pivotal year for dramatic change when it comes to in-office use and presence. Despite all the return to office noise today, corporate office occupancy is still generally hovering between 30 and 50%, depending on who you're talking to. Things like the city, the industry, all play a factor into that return metric. And that essentially is the equivalent of anywhere from 1.5 to 2.5 days a week for most companies. Flex Index data is showing that generally a 50-50 split between companies that want employees in the office less than 3 days or 3 days or more. So it's basically an even split of people wanting to be in the office versus not being, not people, organizations wanting people in the office versus not, which we'll talk to Brian Elliott about that momentarily. What's interesting, though, is that where some believe that in-office presence is necessary to drive engagement, the Gallup organization has been tracking engagement in offices since the year 2000. And so I was curious and wanted to throw out some fun facts in this regard, because we have heard recently, a lot of organizations speaking about the in-office presence somehow drives up employee engagement. And in 2000, Gallup reported that employee engagement was at a mere 26% in the US, which is pretty bad. And in June of 2020, during the thick of COVID, with everyone working from home, we hit an all-time peak of 40%. Didn't stay there for very long, but we did hit 40%. So I thought that was really interesting. Today, Gallup is reporting that for 2024, we're hovering at 33%. So we're up from where we were in 2000, but we're not anywhere near where we would think that we would be given the number today. All this considered, this leads us to the question, is data more valuable to drive stringent enforcement of return to office policies, or should data be embraced to reevaluate and better align to more meaningful approaches to return to office that essentially really drives business value? So let's get started with our panel discussion. And I'll start off with the first question. I'll direct this to Brian Elliott. So what do you think, or why do you think companies are still experimenting with return to office in 2024?
I think it's actually kind of cool that people are running a range of different experiments, and sometimes it's phrased as return to office, but it's often just phrased as what's the best and right solution for my team or my organization. The range of outcomes here is huge. Like you're referencing the Flex Index data earlier, Sandra. If you sat back in 2019 and said that only a third of North American companies would have a 5-day week in the office policy 5 years out, nobody would have believed you. Where we sit today is you've got about a third of companies overall that are 5 days a week in the office. You've got about a third that have some form of structured hybrid program, 2 days a week, 3 days a week, all kinds of substructures underneath that. And you got about a third that have something that's more like employee choice. Usually there's an office that people can access when they need it or when the team needs it. But more broadly, it's the employees choosing. What we're really talking about usually is the people that are in the middle of this. Like, what's the right hybrid approach to making this work? And the data becomes really important for two reasons. One is what you kind of want to know is, as those behaviors change, do they impact outcomes in any given direction, right? So I'll give you one that isn't just about are people complying with the mandate. One issue that some firms are concerned about, rightfully, is are people who are showing up more often getting disproportionate access to leaders and getting promoted more, right? So proximity bias, does that come into play? And if you have insights and data into are people coming in more often getting promoted, regardless of their performance, it's probably something that you want to know one way or the other. You may want to manage it, you may want to manage for it. The other side is just literally planning. There's a massive challenge that a lot of you all are facing, which is the mass uncertainty. The sort of demands on workplace professionals have grown exponentially over the past 5 years in terms of not just old formulas of 100 to 125 square feet per person and one-to-one desking, but all the changes to hoteling, all of the shifts in the market. And if you understand better what you're seeing coming forward and can marry that up with your hiring plans, it just becomes a lot easier to start planning out, for future space needs. In doing that, I think where life might even become more entertaining for us over the coming years is, how do you benchmark up against other organizations? So I've had this conversation a lot of times recently. There are executives, there's two reasons for benchmarking against your peers. One is, you may have an executive who's breathing down your neck and saying, I said 3 days a week in the office is the answer. Why are we only getting 2? And you could call up a dozen different friends and you probably hear the same answer, which is, you're not alone. That's pretty standard these days. But it would be great if we had the ability to benchmark how those policies relate to actual, utilization. But the other thing that you want to know is, are we in line with other people? And therefore, can I use this to sort of plan my way forward? Because I've got big leases that are coming up to their expiry date, right? Or I'm considering I'm trying to convince leadership that we need to redesign this space. How do I get over the fact that some people think that this is going to, shift back in a different direction over the coming years? So there's ways to use this data that aren't just about whether or not an employee is compliant. There's actually really important ways in which we need to use this data to say, are we actually building spaces that work for teams that need the space in the first place?
Absolutely. Nick, you're on the other side of it. You're, obviously, being part of OccuSpace and very close to the data. What are you hearing through conversations that you're having with customers about return to office and sort of the need that's driving the interest in the data?
I mean, obviously, COVID played a big part in changing behavior. And now that there's this new behavioral change, everybody's trying to figure out what's actually happening. We have less of a clear idea of what today than maybe we ever have, or at least in 30, 50 years. And so they want data to truly understand the reality of the space. And folks are starting to realize that things like badge data, can show good directional accuracy and is helpful, often doesn't tell the whole story. We have a lot of customers who they're at 55, 65% badging data, but their peak occupancy in a building never passes 30, 35% during the day. And so there's a big discrepancy there. People are trying to figure it out. But I think what Brian hit on is what I'm hearing a lot of is, we don't just want 2 days a week or 3 days a week or 5 days a week for some arbitrary reason. We want it because there's some outcomes we want to design for. We want more productive employees that have a better experience, are more engaged. We can build culture. We want to have good retention and recruitment. And, those are probably the big ones, in productivity in the office. And so I think folks are getting a lot smarter at realizing it's not just how many days a week are people coming in, it's measuring what's the impact of these policies in the parts of our business that we care about. And I think getting more data into how the space is used is key to understanding the truth and the reality of what's happening in your offices.
Yeah, I totally agree with you in terms of, right now the focus is very much so, or at least it feels very much so, on the number of days that people are coming into the office and trying to comply. I mean, you've all have heard or seen the Amazon announcement of going from 3 days to 5 days in January. And there's a lot of companies that are rethinking their return to office policies. And it seems to be really much focused on, we need to get the numbers up. We've got all this real estate, we've got to bring people back. And then there's all the set of excuses as to why you want to bring people back. But the reality is the optics of those decisions say a lot more about the organization in terms of positioning. So whether it's the brand and the things that you care about, like, you're talking about broader business objectives that touch upon things like sustainability and diversity and equity and, wellness and all of those things that, that one decision about the purpose and role of real estate has an impact on all those other areas. Now, the unfortunate thing is not very many companies realize that. They're just very laser focused on getting the numbers up.
Mm-hmm.
Moving on, Albert, I wanted to ask you, There's a lot of noise in the background. Albert, this question is for you. So I mentioned earlier that only 17% of organizations enforce their return to office policies, with space utilization hovering, between that 30 to 50. And I'm being generous because it's probably a lot lower, just because over time utilization tends to mature and kind of drop. It doesn't necessarily go up. What space utilization data points can organizations use to inform and rethink their policies, their designs, to really align with employee behaviors that support optimal space and employee needs?
Well, Sandra, and this is something I think Brian and I probably align on, is that occupancy and utilization is one data point that is incredibly limited and tells you nothing about experience. So what I'm really concerned about is that CFOs see, oh, my workspace is only being used 25% of the time, so then I can scale that down with the same kind of crappy typologies that we've had in the past. And what I really think there's an opportunity to say here is let's look at what performance gaps or where we took performance hits during COVID, and start thinking differently about how we reposition the workplace. Do we really want to go back to open seating or benching and just scale that down because we think there's an opportunity to achieve or generate 30% efficiency? All you're going to do is you're going to invite people back into an office that they didn't really want to go back to in the first place. So what I'm hoping, and I'll be honest with you, I'm not very optimistic about this, but what I'm hoping is that practitioners such as ourselves and or even real estate leadership are offering better ideas to how people want to work than just scaling on concepts that were around for 25 years that never really generated any real employee satisfaction. So I think there's an opportunity here. I think we have a small window of opportunity to think about how these metrics can inform design, and how then design can provide a better solution for what people actually want in the workplace. And I'll end with this: is typically, I think everybody on this panel knows this, is that pre-COVID, probably the biggest performance gaps in the workplace were noise and distractions.
Yes.
Yet we are still providing workplaces that might be smaller, but suffer from, or at least are impeded by noise and distractions. So my question is, why can't we do better? And one thing I kind of wanted to ask Brian was this: is because my opinion is that benchmarking was great before COVID, but I'm not sure what benchmarking does for us now.
Yeah. I think it's a good question. I think it's a great question, actually. There are parts of it that are scratching an itch. So I've had people leaders in particular say, I'll give you an example. CEO's breathing down my neck. CEO said 3 days a week, and we're only getting 2. And we've explained to him that pre-pandemic, when we were 5 days a week, we averaged, and you all know this, you averaged 2.5 to 3. Every company in existence averaged 2.5 to 3. But they're still not getting it. They're not getting the thing that they wanted out of it. Are we abnormal? And so just scratching the itch of are we abnormal sometimes is helpful, because it helps you shift the conversation away from compliance to what are we really trying to accomplish here? Like, what problem are we trying to solve? And can we measure that problem instead? Do we have a retention issue? Great. Where do we have a retention issue that we need to solve? If we have a productivity issue, what is the productivity that we're seeking? So that's that side of it. I do think that benchmarking, when in my conversations with people, it's all over the place. Benchmarking for some folks is like, I don't need that. I've got my internal data. My internal data is all that I need because it's about us and it's about what we need. But there are questions, because the world is evolving so rapidly, that I am finding people are grappling with, which is, as I shift my designs in spaces, if I had evidence that other firms that had done what you're describing, Albert, that had actually sat there and said, we know the 2018 floor plan and layout didn't work for people very effectively. Am I getting better utilization out of shifting and putting the money against redesigning the space in ways that teams appreciate it? right? Then I'm starting to be able to make the case for decisions around redesign. If I knew and had more evidence that these, let's put it this way, here's another one that actually the Flex Index stuff does help you with. The headlines are all about the Andy Jassy's of the world. The headlines get written about the executives that are making the big noises and pushing people back into the office. If you look at the Flex Index data, you'd sit there and go, that's lovely, but those are points. And the overall data says that's not the trend line, right? The trend line is actually more towards hybrid and less towards full-time in the office. Knowing that helps you also plan from like a growth and expansion perspective, because if you've got executives that are continually fighting over, but someday we're going to be all back full-time in the office, there's now 3 years of evidence that says this is not happening. And we've been saying the same thing, by the way, for 3 years. That prediction has been there.
I think the thing just
it's more that it's those kind of executive debates. People who are aligned with executives and the team, and everybody's like, yeah, we know what we're doing. Don't need it as much as people were like, we're arguing over our own lived experience, or we're arguing over a perspective that's unique, and we're not bringing any kind of data into the conversation where data can actually be helpful.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you, Brian. It's actually interesting, looking at the Flex Index data and just what we're hearing about how diverse the return to office policies are and what's underneath them. You can't really use them for benchmarking to say, okay, the financial industry is, 5 days a week and, whatever the case might be, because there's so much underneath that. You've got some companies that are dictating specific days of the week. You've got other companies that it's 3 days, but employees decide. And so 3 days in the office doesn't mean the exact same thing across the board. And so if everybody's doing 3 days a week, there's so much variation in there, and that's just what's being asked. It's not necessarily what's actually happening. On the note of the other issues with the workforce and just other problems that might be showing up as a result of office use, I want to turn to Kara. Because Kara, you obviously are coming at it from the HR side. You're much more familiar with engagement scores and kind of are hearing it from both employers and from employees just in the line of work that you do. What are you hearing? What are you experiencing? What are you seeing as, the major sort of issues as it relates to using data to drive return to office policies? We were talking just prior to going live about how, the data is sometimes conflicting. So just wanted to get your perspective.
Yeah, I think that this is a really great conversation about bringing data into the conversation because it's so important. A little bit about my background for the last 6 years, I've helped over 5,000 people through a job search. And so I know what the employees in a job search are looking for, and from a more personal level. And so when we see a lot of these reports and these surveys, like we were talking about before we started, you do have to take them with a grain of salt because it really depends on, like we talked about, the questions that are answered and the respondents, et cetera. But the fact of the matter is that they're all out there and they're all conflicting. And the other thing is that there's a lot of companies that even admit to the fact that they don't have data or a reporting structure on their RTO policies. And that's frustrating when it comes to the employees, when it comes to job seekers, when it comes to the workforce, and building that trust and that transparency in your culture. Mm-hmm. And so when it comes to employee engagement, what I'm seeing in some of this data, but mostly on an individual level, is that employees are just frustrated. They are lacking trust in corporations, in leadership, and they feel like they're just required to do things without a why behind it. And as most of us know, with change management, most people will buy in when they understand the why behind it, right? And so they feel that there's just this mistrust, this more big brother sort of situation. And so now we're seeing things like the green status effect. Whether you're in office or remote, employees are doing things in order to prove that they're being productive without actually being productive, right? They're walking around the office, they're making sure that their green light is on if they're remote. And so what that's telling me is there's not the why behind it. There's people that are getting frustrated, the employees. There's, even if we want to go even further, right? people with disabilities, right? They're not being considered by their leadership about, hey, is this going to help out, right? The engagement scores were higher when they were home, right? Because they were able to be accommodated in the way that they needed to be. They're not being compensated for having to go back and return to office, right? It costs almost up to $1,000 a month for someone to commute into an office, and that's not necessarily always being considered. And so there's this underlying tension between employees and corporations, and they feel kind of stuck. And so that's why I am a huge proponent of this conversation of having data, and it has to almost be individualized, right? Why are we coming back? Here's why we are coming back, and the goals and KPIs for specific teams or corporations to prove out, and to have almost a timeline, right? We're going to try this, we're going to report out, and here's the reasons why, and then we're going to adjust accordingly, right? And I also love the conversation that Albert was having about really designing spaces employee first, right? Because that is a corporation's greatest resource. They're customer facing, they're going to take care of your product, et cetera. And so I think one of the biggest missteps that a lot of companies have had in this era of trying to figure it out and just sort of making guesses is not necessarily bringing that transparency into the conversation.
Yeah, totally agree. Brian, I'm going to get to you in a second. I just wanted to make a comment. So one of the things that I often wonder about, and I having been sort of on the other side as a workplace strategist and kind of doing research and analytics for so many years, is who actually owns the storytelling, right? So when you think about how organizations need to work together, you've got corporate real estate, you've got HR, you've got IT, different data owners. That data is doing different things, or it's serving different purposes in organizations. But ultimately, this data needs to come together. And that's something that I think organizations have struggled with. So you've got disparate data sources that serve a very different purpose. And then you've got, a demand from the higher ups that are saying, hey, we've got too much real estate, figure out how to get rid of real estate so that we can save some money. But it's not something that's only driven by real estate. You have to bring these different groups together, and more importantly, the data sets for these different groups, and look at it much more holistically. So with that being said, I want to turn it over to Brian, because Brian Aman, because Brian is coming at it from the customer side. So he's at Rogers Communications. And so Brian, maybe if you can sort of walk us through, what your experience is like with return to office, and kind of the pushback either from the employees and maybe the top-down sort of requirements to do something about the real estate. Please share with us what you can, because we're all ears.
No worries. Hopefully I'm unmuted. First of all, I'm going to say, Sandra, in terms of what my position is, the data and the information that we're collecting and we're gaining insights from is really driven towards increasing the value of the office, supporting our employees to do better, and supporting their experience. Obviously, that data can equally be used for, looking at how are people complying with hybrid policies, and even for enforcement if it gets to that. But frankly, I'd like to stay away from that camp. I think that that doesn't benefit neither the organization nor the employees, frankly. But that's really a leadership and an HR kind of responsibility and decision at the end of the day. I'm living just about everything that you guys kind of brought up on this conversation, right? Are we looking at benchmarks? Yes, we are. Are benchmarks usable, given that the playing field has changed when it comes to workplace and workplace of the future and strategy, Albert? I would say it's good to look at the benchmark, but we're very cognizant that those benchmarks or baselines are maybe flawed because they're measuring the wrong things and focus on the wrong things. And we really need to think about redefining what the next level of metrics and KPIs need to be to measure success of workplaces and whether they're fit for purpose. And I would say that for us at Rogers, having embarked in a pretty robust activity-based workplace design just prior to the pandemic, and rolled out a bunch of spaces to that level of design, we're in a decent place because we have a pretty wide spectrum of kit of parts. The calibration is probably needs to be relooked at because pandemic has just proven that our work behaviors, our work patterns, our habits have changed. So the calibration really needs to be taken care of, looked at carefully. I'll give you one example. Big 8, 10, 12 person meeting rooms are not well utilized. And we know that the 3 to 4 person, and probably even before the pandemic, frankly, was more widely utilized. And then the other layer of it is technology and what we use in those spaces and how the space is being utilized. So I can tell you that the meeting rooms that have video conferencing units are the first ones to be taken up and or reserved, and the ones that don't have it, which we're going to call the analog or the tradition type we spaces, are simply not being as well utilized as the others. And that's simply because we live in a hybrid world where in no given meeting, you're going to have 100% in-person attendance anymore. I would challenge our teams to say we are a national team that has cross-functional teams across the country, different time zone, different places. So that was never the case anyway. So I think hybrid and post-pandemic has really forced people to think differently about what people do when they come into the office, and hopefully our policies and our leadership would start adjusting as they experience how people are actually leveraging the space. The data that we're gaining from Wi-Fi cross-referencing and triaging against security badge data, observation, and conversations with all our end users is really starting to inform and help us challenge even what our design guidelines are today, and even have conversations, open conversations, frankly, with leadership that are asking us, well, how many days are people coming in? Are they conforming to our hybrid policy? And the answer is no, and that's true of every organization across the globe. And Brian, you and I talked about this jokingly when you were in Toronto. I said, I think the formula is whatever the mandate is, -1, plus or minus, right? So take any organization, ask them, what's your policy? Look at their either badge data or Wi-Fi data, and it probably is going to tell you that that secret formula is probably just about right. So the questions that we should be asking ourselves is, why aren't people conforming? And if they're not, how does our policy need to change? Does the workplace have any bearing or impact and why people are coming in or not? And we can adjust and change those design guidelines in the design going forward. The one thing that I think I've maybe started to change and pivot my mindset on is we're not just going to reset our design standards and think we got it right. I think this change is so huge that we're going to go through an iterative process for the next, I don't know, I'm not going to even put a timeline, but I think our mindset needs to change to say we got to continue to test, iterate, and keep getting it better and better. I don't think anybody's going to solve this in the next wave of renovations over the next 3-5 years.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think what's funny is you say -1. My conversations with several companies that were actually flex before COVID is more like cut it in half. So if you're 5 day, you're 2.5 days. If you're 3 days, you're maybe 1.5 days. And I've heard that consistently, that because of the maturity of, as people get used to the idea of working flexibly, that's kind of the direction that it goes in. It's very hard to, sort of reverse it once you're sort of, as someone said the other day, once the toothpaste is out of the tube, you can't bring it back. So you got to work with what you have. You got to sort of move it forward. I also want to allow for a conversation about, what companies are actually enforcing compliance through things like promotions and compensation, because it's one thing to say you need to come back to the office. And we all know, I mean, there's been a lot of chatter, out there about why companies are demanding higher days in the office. It's, it's for, natural attrition, where people will, naturally leave because they don't want to come back to the office 5 days a week. But, are companies actually doing anything to try to bring people back to make it more enticing? And I also will add to that, and I'll get to Nick in a minute, in terms of, how is that working? Because again, there's things that you can do from a benefits and perks perspective, but then when you look at the data and you look at observations, occupancy is one thing, but then there's also that telltale metric, which is dwell time, right? Coffee badging, which we'll talk about. So Brian, maybe if you want to tackle that one, Brian Elliott.
You can't happy hour your way into people coming in.
It works. Don't cut it anymore.
Right. No, exactly. Look, there are elements of space design that can influence this, right? Meaning, and the range here is huge. If let's start with a better starting point. The better starting point is figuring out with your team what your patterns look like is the most important thing, right? On average, most people want to come and be together with their team a couple of days a week, but figuring that out can be part of the challenge. Just the literal act of coordination. So there's all kinds of tools out there that are doing that these days, and I think doing it pretty well to help people figure out like what are the right days of the week for my team, because it is very team dependent, right? If you're a sales team, figuring out like what are our anchor days and how they're centered around like a pipeline review plus a training, show and tell type of event on Tuesdays and on Wednesdays, it takes you a lot further, honestly, than what the office layout and setup is. The office and layout and setup can be an enabler or an inhibitor. And let's face it, right? If everybody's coming back into 2019 spaces, open office floor plans, and there's not enough places to take calls with customers, even among sales teams. I know sales teams who've been commanded to be back in the office that instead go to the coffee shop next door or even a public library in one case in order to take calls because they can't find a quiet space to do it in the office, right? So that's just plain old problematic. For a lot of engineering teams, I've had a couple of CTOs say there's no way I'm commanding my people to come back in because we've not invested in dual monitors and setups. Their home setups are way better than what we're providing them. It's just not going to happen. But I do think giving people like the collaborative spaces that they need, the social spaces that they want, and having that be the primary focus is where I'm seeing people get more traction, right? As opposed to thinking this as we're going to set them back to where they were and it's going to somehow work.
Yeah. I want to go back also to the storytelling question, pose this question to Albert. I mean, in your experience, obviously you're doing, strategy, you're sort of telling that story. You're talking to the, senior leadership team, not just the design team. There's a lot of focus on storytelling. How is that being received? Like, beyond just the space aspect of it in terms of what needs to happen?
Well, I think storytelling goes into or plugs into the idea that really the post-COVID work environment is not competing with the home office in terms of amenities. It's competing with the home office because the home office provides benefits that the work environment does not. So the question then begets itself, then why would people come in? And I just want to touch on something that Brian had said earlier, is if you take a look, our research is indicating that the two highest performing spaces in any given office right now, when people do go in, are small huddle rooms, 45 people, and private areas where people can actually get work done. What's ironic and actually coincidental about those two spaces, they're actually about the same specifications. They're about the same size, and you can pretty much appoint them with the same furniture. So you can easily scale those spaces depending on what the need is at any given point. I would say the storytelling comes in is one of the performance kind of hits that we saw during COVID was that people were not kind of feeling connected into the brand promise. That's something that they can't, or probably, I doubt a lot of people are putting up a lot of brand collateral in their home office about the company they work for. What they want to do is when they walk into the workspace, and this is part of that community building piece, is when they walk into that workspace, they want to feel some emotional connection to what they're doing. They want to strengthen those strong ties, and they want to strengthen the weaker ties that, again, took a hit during COVID.
Very interesting. Anyone else have anything to add? Kara?
I'll add on to like the perks and a little bit onto what Albert said is from my experience working with job seekers and kind of studying with all this is there's not a lot of perks that if someone is really thriving at home, they like the remote work, there's not a lot of perks that will bring them back to the office. A lot of perks that have been offered that I've seen and also in some surveys are like fuel reimbursement, the unlimited PTO, the 4-day work weeks, right? The health insurance, the pizza lunches, like all that other good stuff. And time and time again, under 50% of those employees will accept those perks as like a driver to bring them back into the office. However, to touch on with Albert, what I do hear is that time and time again, high achievers, leaders, people who want to be fulfilled in their careers, they want to make an impact and they want to be a part of something. They want to be a part of a community. And I think that that's true of just about all of us, especially after 2020, right? When we felt very isolated, very alone. And so bringing people, whether they're remote or hybrid or in office, underneath the umbrella of your brand and really having people feel ingratiated to your company and into the community is something that people have been craving. And so I like this conversation when it comes to the designing the office space, but also bringing those hybrid workers in and making them feel part of that community, or even the remote ones as well, because that's something that I think a lot of people are craving, is that connection. But when it comes to perks, it's really not a lot that will drive someone who wants to be remote in, unless it's like a monetary.
Yeah.
And Kara, I will say this is, when we're talking about hybrid work, the demographic that is most impacted, this came out in the New York Times article recently, the demographic that's most impacted are single moms.
Yes.
Around hybrid work. And I'm not entirely sure single moms care about free kombucha on tap.
No, it's so funny. I just got a report out 30 minutes before we joined this, that childcare reimbursement, only 17% of people would be driven to go back into office, even by childcare. And women have been adversely affected by the pandemic and having to be caretakers. So I'm glad you brought that up.
And Sandra, I was going to say, generally speaking, that I don't think perks, these amenities that we talk so much about, really are the draw that leadership maybe perceive they might be. And they might be dollars better spent elsewhere, frankly. But that's a personal opinion in many ways, just reading a lot of research paper on that as well. But trying to get the calibration right, like we talked about, Albert talked about noise. That's been a problem in the design industry for decades, and we still don't seem to be able to solve it appropriately. Those two pieces, I think, would go a long way to making the office more fit for purpose. And Brian did bring up another pain point with hybrid specifically, and that's the cadence when people are coming into the office. Not having the people that you intend to meet in the office in real life not be there is a bummer, and it really ticks people off. Mm-hmm. And I think the other kind of related problem to cadence in the office is we frankly have too much space, and our inability, which is where data may come into play and help us, to manage dynamic occupancy and kind of compress that foot traffic into smaller space so that it feels more energetic and a place where you actually want to go to work, is something that we need to continue to work on. It's something that, as you know, I'm trying to solve within our own real estate spaces as well.
I think the point that you make about, fit for purpose and trying to still solve for, the fluidity of use is a key point, because we tend, or traditionally we have designed spaces based on sort of, certain activity-based work, sort of, some of the lingo that's been used in the past, where there's design intent behind, how you lay out a space. And we know, whether it's because the space doesn't just, fit the purpose anymore, but even in cases where you've got beautiful space, we do see, I've seen it firsthand, where people just hack the space. It's like, yeah, design says this space is to do X, Y, Z, and then your employees come in and they're just going to use the space for whatever it is that they need at that moment in time. And so that's where the disconnect is it's very hard to keep up with the demand when that keeps changing. And really the only way to address that is if you have access and visibility to data on an ongoing basis, so that instead of, changing furniture, like we talk about, modular furniture to accommodate this sort of dynamic planning, make people more, like mobilize people more so with the information, so that they know what spaces are available, where they can go, what spaces they can use, how busy are certain areas versus how quiet they are, to accommodate that diversity or that neurodiversity that people have when they're in an office environment. I did want to go back though to the conversation around, occupancy counts and such as it relates to, design and policies and those types of things. Because the other big thing that we haven't really talked about here is, the dwell time, right? So yeah, people are coming back, but there's still a problem in that people aren't hanging around. It's not like when you were in the office or expected to be in the office 5 days a week long before COVID, you were expected to be in the office for the full day. So it was in, 8:30 to 5 or whatever the case might be. Today, we're not seeing that anymore. And so I wanted to throw that back at Nick in terms of, from a dwell time perspective, how does that change how you might look at, like return to office policies or just generally, the impact on space in general?
Yeah, we launched dwell time earlier this year. We measure visitors, kind of like a traffic count. We monitor occupancy, how many people are in a space every minute of the day, and you can average that up however you want. And then we launched dwell time recently, and I think dwell time does the best job of telling you, how do people want to experience the space? How do they want to use a space? You could have an area with an average occupancy of 20 people and a dwell time of 20 minutes, or you could have an area with an average occupancy of 20 people and a dwell time of 4 hours. And I think how you design those spaces, how you think about what people want to do in those spaces is so different. And so I think dwell time is really important. And obviously dwell time in your overall building is really important, because we see that you can have, our most extreme example is one customer has 74% badging data and their average occupancy is 22%. Their peak occupancy is something like 36%. And that's shocking, is that your peak occupancy during a day can be 40, 50% lower than the badge swipes that you have, which really tells you that something's not right with that situation that we need to learn more about. And then we can dive deeper into those spaces and figure out, what are people using, where are they staying a short amount of time, a long amount of time, and you can really start to make renovation, design, furniture decisions based on that data. And I'll say, we started OcuSpace in 2018, 2019, right before the pandemic. And the early use cases for our data was, let's identify the popular and unpopular spaces. Let's make more of what's popular, less of what's not popular. And then post-COVID and this return to work era, the biggest use case for our data has been, let's look at how every department's allocated desks at a neighborhood level of granularity. How is each department using their allocated desks? And if, one department has 80 desks because they have 80 employees, let's move to this use it or lose it policy that's becoming very popular with our customers of, we're going to allocate you seats like we allocate budget, where if you got $1 million budget, you spend $500K, you don't get $1 million budget next year. And a lot of folks are doing the same thing with desks. If you have 80 people, but you use 20 desks, you don't get 80 desks anymore. We're going to give you 30 desks or however many you need to comfortably handle your peak occupancy. And then back to kind of the employee experience conversation, that's surprising to me is we've seen the driver for that initially was real estate cost savings. And now we're starting to see the driver of wanting to shrink your employee to desk ratio, or go from 200 square feet per employee to maybe 100 square feet per employee is not just to save money in real estate, but to actually improve the employee experience. And that's something I didn't actually expect to happen. But Kara, Brian, you guys were just mentioning this. The worst experience in an office today is showing up, sitting on Zoom calls all day long, and it being a ghost town. And so companies are realizing, if we actually want to have a good in-office experience, we need high utilization. And if we can't get high utilization by just demanding people come in because it's just not working, then let's actually shrink the footprint, increase the felt occupancy of the space, and people will actually engage with their coworkers, their company, their culture a lot more and have a better in-office experience. So that's probably the biggest surprise of the last 9 months that is becoming a really popular use case. It's not just about the money savings, it's more about the employee experience.
Yeah, no, those are all really, really great points. I think the other thing for me, as I listened to Kara prior to you sharing your thoughts, is, the whole, again, premise of, or the belief that, people want to belong, and sort of all of these things, that there's a lot of that type of conversation. But then when you look at the data, it's like, well, is that really true? And I think that's really where, the value of data comes through, is there's anecdotal sort of ideas or beliefs or things that are entrenched in tradition, or because it worked before. Maybe there was data that was supporting that years ago, but today things are very, very different. Everyone has experienced COVID in the exact same way. We've all experienced work from home. We've all had a very sort of what's the word I'm looking for, like a good or bad sort of experience as a result of that basically drives then our desire to either want to be in an office or not. And so the sense of belonging is, can still come through in the sense that if there's this belief that you bring people back to the office, it's automatically going to create this sense of engagement. It's automatically going to improve productivity and so on and so forth. The data shows otherwise. And it's important for companies to take an interest and lean into that data to basically start to ask the questions of why. Okay, so we've got about 8 minutes left. I wanted to ask another question as it really, and this is for everyone. So let's start with Albert. So if we think about the future of workplace data, what advice would you give organizations that are still relying heavily on traditional enforcement methods or approaches instead of harnessing data for a more adaptive approach?
I'm not necessarily the best quant guy to answer that, but what I would say is it's not just the data that we're getting, it's the translation of that data. And again, I get back to the point of, like, just because your office environment might be utilized 40% of the time doesn't necessarily mean that you should create a new office that's only 70% of the size that has the same typology within it. One of the things that I love what Nick just said is that we're starting to get a really good idea around what spaces are highly utilized. And I'm guilty on this. We used to think that if we put some Barcelona chairs and an Eames chair in an informal collaborative space, everyone's going to go there and sing Kumbaya. That just doesn't happen. And we have to come to the realization that some of those spaces, while were kind of quixotic endeavors, really aren't necessarily functional for the employees that go in there, especially after COVID. So I guess my point there is there's, let's pay attention to that data, but then there's a level of sophistication to understand how that data translates into effective and sometimes counterintuitive from what we used to know, space ideas and space concepts moving into the future.
Great, thank you. Kara, how about you?
In my opinion, when it comes to data and historically, a lot of decisions have always come from top down, and they're not always taking into account the employees. And again, in my opinion, employees are companies' greatest resources. They're the ones that are going to be taking care of your customers and driving your product development and all of that other good stuff. And then they become your customers, right? And so when it comes to data, I believe that it's really important to use it to make decisions, but it also is important to get data from your employees to make decisions that affect your employees. The companies that are employee first, that are looking out for the well-being of your employees, especially after what we've all gone through after the last 4 years, those are the companies that are going to have stronger lasting power. They're going to have more customers buying their products. And they're going to be the ones that are attracting the top talent. And so when it comes to using data to make decisions, I also believe that what is coupled with that is going to be transparency. Why are we making these decisions? And we as leaders are going to abide by the policies that we're moving forward. Just like Brian Amon said, it's hard when employees have to follow the policies and then they see their leaders or not. And so this culture of mistrust that's kind of happening right now, we can leverage data in order to increase that trust and get back to a place that might not be perfect. Obviously, it's never going to be, but to a place where employees feel belong, they feel like they're being taken care of at least a little bit more, and then they're giving their loyalty and their productivity to the companies again.
Thank you for that. And how about Brian Amon? What are your thoughts?
I'd say before you engage in the journey of extracting data, you should really understand what you're trying to measure and what you're trying to achieve. And depending, we were having this conversation early on, right, in the post, Sandra and Nick, that depending on what you're trying to achieve, you may go down a rabbit hole of getting more granular data. And I'd say what Albert said is very critical. You need to understand how to ingest that data and get the right insights out of that data, because if you don't, you're going to be misled. You know, in the past, you'd look at badge data and you use that to size your building. But now that we have dwell data that shows you peak use at a much more granular level, you can really start to understand the use patterns and right size to what should be appropriate. Now, the only concern I have right now with a lot of the information that we're getting is the sensor data is telling us space utilization, dwell time for kit parts that may be outdated, number one, and for workflows that have significantly changed post-pandemic. If we were, I like to say, analog in a 5-day office type office model or operating model, we went fully remote, digital, and now we're hybrid, which is something in between. The workflow is gone analog to digital to something in between, and what the kit parts needs to be to better support that when people choose to be in the office is a complex scenario that nobody's really thought through carefully. And Albert, your days in DEGW with this idea of follow anthropomorphically, you use that day in a life experience, go through what people are going through, understand what their workflows are, then come up with a solution. I think we're in an exciting phase of design where we can look at all this data flow that we're getting, start the conversation with the end users, understand what we're trying to design for, and really reinvent the office and have it fit for purpose. So that's what I'm kind of curious about exploring.
And Brian, to your point, just real quickly, I didn't know Frank. I didn't know Frank Duffy very well, who started DEGW, but he was a bit of a mentor of mine. And one time he said something that was very impactful. He said, "Benchmarking is the quickest way to mediocrity."
Yeah. So much
designed by the law of averages, right? That's not going to help.
Exactly.
Okay, how are we doing for time? We've got 58 minutes. Brian Elliott, maybe if you want to just...
Yeah, two quick points. One, data can help you make decisions, or help inform decisions, but it shouldn't make decisions.
Right.
Even this issue of dwell time, understanding root cause is actually what matters. If you're managing for that and you've got executives who are worried that people are coffee badging, there may be a different underlying story, which is people are coming in for the things that are most effective, which is the meetings with their teams or the time with their team or the social aspects of it. Why are you sweating it? The other reason they may be coffee badging is because you've already told them you don't trust them. I was going to bring it back to Kara's thing, which is if you're putting in place a mandate and you're saying to people, we're going to measure you at the individual level, what you're saying is, I don't trust you. And what you get out of that shouldn't surprise you is people then perform to the metric. And they then basically phone it in from a job perspective. It's been an interesting week and a half post Andy Jassy memo. I've talked to a number of people who, ever since Amazon actually enforced their 3-day-a-week policy, have been happily pillaging their engineering ranks and hiring them into other companies. They're actually thrilled. And they're going to go do more of the same coming out of this one. Okay. So it's interesting times out there. There are really good reasons why people want to come together. You need spaces that actually support them in doing it. The challenges on workplace have gone up phenomenally, and data can help you understand what's working and what's not. But the really important part is listening to the teams and get them to tell you what they need. Absolutely.
Well, thank you to everyone. As you're wrapping up today's discussion, remember that the real power of data isn't just the collection, but in its application. Perhaps even more importantly is the effectiveness of the data, which is driven by the intended use. By using data to understand and adapt rather than simply enforce, we can create workplaces that truly meet the needs of the modern workforce. Thank you to our panelists for their insights and to everyone who joined us today. Don't forget to continue the conversation in your networks and apply these insights to your roles. Thanks to all. Have a great day.
Thanks all.
Awesome.